She was 17 years old. She could not read. She could not write. She had never held a sword until the year she picked one up and walked into a war. They asked her, before she rode, how she could possibly make such a journey. Enemy soldiers on every road. English-held territory for miles in every direction. A peasant girl from a village no one had heard of, alone on a horse she could barely ride. She answered without hesitation, "I am not afraid. I was born to do this." Within 2 years, she would break one of the most decisive sieges in the history of the 100 Years' War. She would march a crowned king into his own cathedral. She would be captured, sold, tried for heresy, and burned alive in a public square at 19 years old. And 25 years after they scattered her ashes into the Seine, the church that condemned her would declare every charge against her null, invalid, and fraudulent. This is the story of Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orléans, the girl the world tried to erase and couldn't. The village of Domremy was the kind of place that did not produce legends. It sat on the border of Lorraine, in a France that was barely France anymore, a country bleeding out through decades of war with England, split between rival French factions, its king uncrowned and its people exhausted. The family of Jacques d'Arc owned a small farm. They were not serfs. They had a house with a glass window, which was something. But the world outside that window was a world at war, and the war had been going on longer than anyone alive could remember. Jeanne, Joan, was born around January 6, 1412. She was one of 5 children, the daughter of a farmer and his wife, Isabelle Romay. She tended sheep. She sewed. She prayed. By all accounts, she was a deeply devout child, but there was nothing about her early life that suggested the future. Nothing visible, anyway. And then, when she was about 13 years old, in her father's garden, a great light appeared. She would later describe it at her trial, clearly, without theatrical elaboration, as a voice accompanied by brightness. Then voices. 3 of them, she said. St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret. At first, they urged her simply to live a good Christian life. But over the following years, the message sharpened. It became specific, almost unbearable in its specificity. She was to leave Domremy. She was to find the uncrowned Dauphin, Charles, the heir to the throne of France. She was to raise the English siege of Orléans, and she was to see Charles crowned at Reims as the rightful king of France. She told no one, not her parents, not her priest. For 3 years, she carried it. That is where the story of Joan of Arc begins, not on a battlefield, but in the silence of a girl who heard something the rest of the world could not hear, and had the terrifying task of deciding whether to believe it. In May 1428, Joan walked to Vaucouleurs. Vaucouleurs was a royal garrison, one of the few towns in the region still loyal to the Dauphin. The captain of the garrison was a man named Robert de Baudricourt. Joan told him she needed horses and an escort. She needed to travel across English-held territory to Chinon, where the Dauphin was, because God had sent her to save France. Baudricourt sent her home. Joan went home. She waited. The voices did not stop. The English siege of Orléans began in October 1428, and the situation grew more dire by the month. The city that stood as the last major defense of the Dauphin's territory was slowly, methodically being starved. France had no real answer. The Dauphin had no plan. Joan returned to Vaucouleurs in January 1429. She was 16 years old. She told Baudricourt she would not leave until he helped her. She stayed. She waited. And something in her certainty, her absolute, unwavering certainty, began to work on the men around her. 2 knights from the garrison, Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy, were convinced enough to offer to escort her themselves. Baudricourt finally relented. Before she rode out into the darkness, a woman from the village called after her. "How can you make such a journey when on all sides are soldiers?" Joan turned back and said, simply, "I am not afraid. I was born to do this." She rode 11 days through enemy territory. She arrived at Chinon. She was examined by theologians for 3 weeks. The church did not certify her as a prophet, but they found nothing heretical in her. She was allowed to proceed. What followed next would change the course of a war and the history of a nation. Episode 1. The Recognition at Chinon. The Dauphin. Charles attempted a test. When Joan arrived at court, he disguised himself, hid among his courtiers to see if this supposed visionary could pick him out. She walked through the crowded hall and went directly to him. The records are clear on this. She knelt before him, addressed him as the true heir of France, and said the voices had sent her to be his help. Charles was not easily convinced of anything. He was by nature cautious, perhaps even timid. But something in that moment lodged itself in him. He allowed Joan to be further examined, this time by a panel of theologians at Poitiers. They interrogated her for weeks. She answered every question. When they told her they needed a sign before they could authorize anything, she told them, "In God's name, I have not come to Poitiers to give signs. Bring me to Orléans, and I will show you the signs for which I was sent." They brought her to Orléans. Episode 2. The Siege of Orléans. The siege had been grinding since October 1428. The English commander, John Talbot, was not in a hurry. He was simply waiting for 40,000 people to run out of food. Joan arrived with the French relief force on April 29th, 1429. She wore white armor. She carried a banner she had commissioned, showing Christ flanked by angels, bearing the words Jesus Maria. She had no formal military training. What she had was an absolute refusal to accept the situation as it stood. Contemporary witnesses who survived to testify at her rehabilitation trial, 25 years later, described the same thing. She rode beneath the enemy walls where no one else dared ride. She insisted on rapid, aggressive assault rather than cautious waiting. She was not a passive figurehead. She was in the battle. On May 7th, 1429, at the Tourelle fortress that anchored the English position on the Loire Bridge, Joan was struck by an arrow between the neck and the shoulder. Witnesses say she pulled the arrow out herself, wept briefly from the pain, prayed, and returned to lead the assault. By nightfall, the Tourelles had fallen. By morning, the English army was marching away. The siege of Orléans, which had seemed unbreakable for 7 months, was over in 9 days. The people who watched her ride through the streets of Orléans were not watching a myth. They were watching a 17-year-old girl who had been told what to do and had done it. Episode 3. The coronation at Reims Orléans was only the beginning. Joan pressed the Dauphin to move immediately toward Reims, the cathedral city where French kings had been crowned for centuries. This was the second part of her mission, the part the royal advisers said was impossible. Reims was deep in English and Burgundian territory. To reach it meant fighting through fortified towns, across hostile countryside with an army that had just emerged from a long siege. Joan's Loire campaign, fought through June and July 1429, cleared the way. Town after town either surrendered or fell. When the French army finally arrived at Reims, the city opened its gates without a fight. On July 17, 1429, Charles VII was crowned King of France in Reims Cathedral. Joan of Arc stood beside him, holding her banner, because, as she would later say at her trial, it had borne the labour, and it was right that it should share the honour. The two things God had told a 13-year-old girl in a garden in Domremy had now been accomplished. What no one tells you about Joan of Arc is what came after the triumph. The campaign stalled. A failed assault on Paris in September 1429 left Joan wounded again. The army was recalled. The king, crowned, safe, politically manoeuvring, had less use for a girl who heard voices now that the voices had done what he needed. The war ground on. Joan fought in other campaigns through the winter. On May 23rd, 1430, outside the town of Compiègne, Joan was pulled from her horse during a Burgundian raid. She was captured. She was imprisoned for months in the castle of Beaurevoir. King Charles VII, the king she had placed on his throne, made no serious effort to ransom or rescue her. The Burgundians sold her to the English for 10,000 livres. The English brought her to Rouen. The trial began on January 9th, 1431, under Bishop Pierre Cochon, a Frenchman who had long served the English occupation. The charges were heresy, witchcraft, and the wearing of men's clothing. The real charge was this: if Joan's voices were real, then God was against England, and everything that followed from her mission was legitimate. That could not be allowed to stand. The trial transcript survives. It is one of the most extraordinary documents in history. Joan answered every question with a precision that astonished her examiners. When they asked whether she knew she was in God's grace, a theological trap designed to make any answer incriminating, she replied, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there." The notary who recorded the session later testified that the entire court fell momentarily silent. When they threatened her with torture, she told them calmly that if they tore her apart, she would maintain what she had said. When they read her sentence aloud in the marketplace, that she was to be handed to secular authorities for execution, she broke. She signed a paper of recantation. She was condemned to life imprisonment instead. 3 days later, her guards found her dressed again in men's clothing. She told them her voices had reproached her for giving in. She retracted the recantation. On May 29th, she was declared a relapsed heretic. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, they led her through the streets of Rouen in a cart. She wore a paper cap with the words, "Relapsed heretic, apostate, idolater." She was bound to a wooden stake in the old marketplace. Before the fire was lit, she asked a priest to hold a crucifix high where she could see it, and to shout the name of Jesus loud enough to be heard above the flames. According to witnesses at her rehabilitation trial, her last word was, "Jesus." She was 19 years old. When it was over, the executioner raked back the fire so the crowd could see she was indeed a woman. Then he built the fire again. Her ashes were thrown into the Seine so that nothing of her could be kept. They had burned her. They had burned her twice. And still, they were not sure it was enough. It was not enough. The English and their Burgundian allies had burned Joan of Arc to destroy the meaning she had given to the French cause. They had burned the wrong thing. The cause outlasted the fire. By 1453, 22 years after her execution, Charles VII had reconquered all of France except Calais. The 100 Years' War, which had consumed the nation for over a century, was over. The English were out of France. In 1456, the Church conducted a new trial. Witnesses who had been present at Rouen in 1431 were called to testify. The notary who had recorded her words, the men who had watched her die. They came and told what they had seen. On July 7, 1456, the original verdict was declared null, invalid, and fraudulent. Every charge against Joan of Arc was overturned. The sentence itself read, "This trial record and sentences that contain deceit, slander, contradiction, and manifest error of law and of fact were and are null, invalid, without effect or value." She was, in history's own judgment, a martyr. In 1920, nearly 5 centuries after her death, Joan of Arc was canonized as a saint of the Catholic Church. She became the patron saint of France, of soldiers, of prisoners, and of those who are mocked for their faith. She is the only person in history to have been condemned as a heretic and canonized as a saint by the same church. She remains the most studied figure of the entire Middle Ages. The girl from Domremy, who could not read, who could not write, who heard voices in her father's garden at 13. She altered the political map of Europe, helped end a 100-year war, and left behind a trial transcript that still speaks after 6 centuries. What is your Orléans today? What is the thing you've been told you cannot do? The calling that seems too large? The voice you've been afraid to trust? Joan of Arc did not begin with an army. She began with a decision to believe what she had been given and to act on it without fear, without permission, and without waiting for the world to make it easy. History forgot them, but they were faithful. And now it's our turn to remember. Subscribe to Forgotten Heroes of Faith.